Good morning. I'm here with Peter Caron. Caron, I'll let you introduce yourself maybe. You've worked on pretty much every building at the village over, the past 40 years or so.
Yeah, I've 1978 started working on buildings here at the Ukrainian village. Prior to that, I was doing historic buildings in Ontario and Quebec.
And so we're in front of the Grekul house here. It's a Ukrainian farmstead, and it was built in 1915, but the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village is depicting this to an era of 1918 to 1919, based on a lot of research.
Yes.
So you're involved in the restoration of this one as well.
Yeah, this one pretty well made out of spruce and pine logs, and it's a box notch where the corners are two sort of half square notches that come together, and the logs are pinned together with wooden pins, handmade octagonal wooden pins that go through 3 logs at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty well from the blue line, where you see the blue line on the clay down, is all new material, and the back wall between these 2 posts here was totally rotted out, and so the building was lifted up, and all the log work was completed and then put back down. All the samples of paint and clay were all sampled, and so we could reproduce it as closely as possible. And in the restoration, all of the tool marks that I could identify on the wooden components, including the components that we can't see because they're covered in clay, I use those same tools to do the work. So I would leave the same tool marks behind as the original builder did. The building was covered on the inside and the outside with a clay plaster, and then as you can see, whitewashed on top of that.
And the roof is a hipped roof, and it's pretty typical of many buildings of this period, that Ukrainians brought their vernacular traditions, what is really medieval sort of technology and building traditions. It had developed over hundreds of years. And we also see the gambrel cant on the 2 ends, which help strengthen the roof structure, to my understanding.
Yeah, it's a great, there's some long beams hewn with a broad axe. All the tool marks that you see on this building, I used those tools in the restoration. So I would leave the same tool marks that the original builder used. It is an ancient sort of tradition, a building tradition, but it was a we'll call it a peasant culture, but by no means does a peasant culture mean that they were not extremely innovative in their use of building materials, and as well innovative in their design. Today's a good day because here's the first day of fall here in Alberta, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Alberta, we are the land of 30 degrees above Celsius in the summer and 30 degrees below Celsius in the winter. So it's was a real game of survival. But back to the design. If you can see the windows right here that we're standing behind, it's the first day of fall here, and the windows are in full sun, and they will remain in full sun until the first day of spring, and after that the shadow line here will go down. So in the summertime, height of the summer, at the height of the day, these windows will be in full shade. Thinking in today's terms of solar, this is a great design, taking maximum exposure to the sun at the times of year when you want that.
And then efficiently using the building materials that are around them, gathering logs from close by when they can.
Logs
and
will
then
be
clay from right below their feet, right?
almost.
Yeah.
I'm presently working at another site, but I still use the same formula at the site I'm working at now that I did at this site, and that is drawing a 10-mile circle around the site and all of your, which is a day's wagon ride. So in that day's wagon ride, you need to find almost all of your building materials. Logs would be local, clay would be local.
Sand as well, if they're mixing that in.
Sand is here somewhere, and for us who don't live exactly on this site, if you lived on this site and you were homesteading this site, you would know what's available on your site, where the water is, where the sandy spot is, where the clay pit is. You would get familiar with those materials, and if not, then it's your neighbor or their neighbor or close to the river, and that's where your building materials come from.
Mm-hmm. And then, so we're also seeing a lot of decoration on the front. The corbels here have been cut away to
Yes.
a relatively simple mold, but that's time and effort that they put in.
That's
to
time and
make
effort.
this look beautiful.
Yep.
And the ends of the rafter plates, which are doweled in as well, you can see coming down. So could you explain what kind of notch they would have used on these rafter tails, or where it's joined into the plate?
That's a dovetail. The modern dovetails. I should have a pad. The upper sketch shows the traditional bird's mouth, which locks the bottom of the rafter into the top plate, and the bottom sketch is a modern version of a bird's mouth, where the rafter sits on top of the top plate. Both of them would have been pinned.
Either with steel or wooden dowels, correct?
Yep, wooden dowels, which are handmade octagonal dowels, and the ends of which you can see sticking out up here if you have a look. And in some cases they were spiked with large metal nails.
Another decoration I guess we could talk about is the obvious blue, white, and black banding. This is a lime wash on top of a clay plaster, which has been daubed on top of the log structure.
Yes.
And could you describe the blue apron wash, as we call it, and the black soot wash at the base?
Well, I think you did more research into the exact. Originally, we were matching it with an acrylic paint.
Yes.
That was the original match, and I think you have done more investigation into the blue.
Building on the historical research that was done for the site, oral histories, in the land and structural history, they describe taking lime and boiling it in water. Well, we're probably not boiling the water. This is probably quicklime that they're buying and mixing in water. It would then boil the water. They would wait for that hot lime wash to cool before adding to both the white and a lot more to the blue. They would add laundry bluing. So we did have a few pieces, about the size of a dime. So we were able to do chemical analysis. We did fancy stuff like scanning electron microscopy and FTIR, but I was actually able to use simpler methods like chemical spot analysis and microscopy to confirm. We just happened to have a couple chemistry students and geology students working with us at the time, so they gave us that 100% confirmation. But we know that the pigments that they used was ultramarine, and that makes sense compared to the other commonly available laundry bluing in the hardware stores around here, which was Mrs. Stewart's Prussian blue, which is less stable than Reckitt's industrial manufactured laundry bluing of ultramarine. So that was kind of neat to find that out. And we did do some mock-ups and trying to replicate hot lime washes with pigments and figure out the recipes. And but site maintenance is a reality, and we were seeing a use of acrylic and lime here. Yeah.
So it was reasonably, the acrylic lime mix was reasonably successful, but all of these buildings and have architectural details like the large overhangs to protect the clay. Goes a long way in helping it as well. In some ways, it's the buildings look great today, but in some ways, it's a small portion of the year that the buildings look this good because the weather beats them up pretty well. And we'll look around, and if we see, you may notice in the texture that in some places it looks rather patchy, and that's indicative of the ongoing maintenance to these buildings, because it's very much the lime wash and the clay takes a beating from the weather.
Especially on the north elevations where it takes longer for
Very
that
much.
clay to dry out, and so there's more dissolution, delamination of those coatings. So below the apron wash, actually, we also see a black line here, and that's a soot wash, isn't it?
That's a soot wash, yep.
Mixing an ash to get that color. And there's another architectural element here. Might look kind of like a walkway or patio. This is the presba, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
and this is a traditional. Some of the prispas are like a walkway, and some of them are actually raised to the point where you could sit on them like a bench. This one consistently washed away, and now you can see the addition of a wooden edge, which helps hold it. Helps somewhat to hold it together, and there's an addition of about 10% cement to make it a little tougher as well.
This site has obvious realities of much higher traffic than would have happened traditionally, with some events seeing 3,000, 4,000 people. When you get that kind of traffic going through these traditional materials, we obviously see erosion happening on a much faster pace.
As you can see by the door, it takes a beating, because with so many people walking by, a lot of these buildings, you can they look maintained now, but as Evan said, one weekend of 3,000 people, and that'll need serious surgery.
And what kind of shingles do we have up on the roof?
These are cedar shingles, turn of the century, late 1800s. About 70%, 80% of the production of lumber in British Columbia, cedar and other materials, came to the prairie provinces. Before that, most of the material, that's before the railway, most of the material came up from Minnesota in the U.S. through Winnipeg and came west this way. After the railway, a lot of the material came from British Columbia. These are sawn shingles, but they're cedar.
And so there was another alternative roofing material as well that was often used by early Ukrainian settlers, right?
Two other materials on this site. At the Bordet, there's a sod roof, and behind us there's a roof with a thatch. That's a straw thatched roof.
We're now inside the Grekul house, and we thought that we could explain a little bit about the spatial layout of what would be a traditional house in Ukraine around 1910 and for a couple hundred years earlier. This would actually be an example of a more well-to-do house, is my understanding.
Yes, it's a successful transition to living in Canada. One level up on the peasant scale, or.
And there's all sorts of interesting details in terms of interior finishing in here. If we look down at the baseboard, for instance, we can see that there's a blue washing with a wave decorative motif. Of course, all the clay plaster walls here are lime washed. I believe there was an effort at one point to actually retain original clay plaster with the use of screws and clay washers. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yeah.
With mixed success, is that right?
In this, multiple buildings on this site. As we spoke about outside, where the bottom portion of the walls were decayed and had to be completely removed, the upper portions of the walls in this house, the remaining clay plaster was mechanically fastened to the wall to keep it there. And as much as possible, the original plaster is still mechanically attached to the walls and infilled between the portions of original plaster are new plaster. Hopefully you can't see where the new and the old come together.
Yeah, and this beam, which in English architecture we would kind of call this a summer beam, I suppose, when we think of buildings in the northeast
Yes.
of in New England and that sort of thing. And we've got this really pretty little carving of a crucifix here. But I think I've seen some old photographs during the restoration process where this beam was actually reinforced with steel.
Many of the building components, it wasn't until after 1940 that there was actually a building code of any description. Up till then and before that, it was tradition and good practice, and how deep your pockets were. So these beams, by today's standards, are undersized. The space between them are too big, and there is some worry of collapse because up above this floor, in lots of these buildings, there's a layer of straw for insulation and then another layer of 3 or 4 inches of clay to make a hard floor up in the attic space, which was used for storage of materials, and in some cases smoke would go up into the attic, and meat and fish could be smoked in the attic as a preservative treatment. These beams being undersized, we did what at the time was called a weir system. And so down the center of these beams, there was a slot cut. About a 5-inch piece of steel was placed in that slot. The whole thing was surrounded by pouring in epoxy, which bonded the 3 materials together and upped the strength of these beams 6, 7, 8 times stronger, so they would be a safer beam. By and large, that works. The 3 different materials together over time have a bit of a tendency to separate because they all shrink and swell at different rates, and so that's part of the reason why these buildings are as they're not occupied, but they're still heated year-round to minimize the amount of movement in the different materials.
So now we're standing in front of the Grekul House Peach, which is a reconstruction, to my understanding, of a typical peach. And what does a peach mean?
Peach is a bake oven, and a wood-fired bake oven. This one's about 1,500 pounds of clay on a wooden base here. Inside the base, there's a layer of loose stones as a heat sink, and then the bottom 6 or 8 inches is solid clay. On top of the clay, there's a framework of willow sticks, cross-hatched, and those willow sticks are buried in a thickness of clay. And the inside shape of the oven from the door rises up and then goes down This is a Ukrainian style. It's wood fired, so the wood gets put in there. My personal opinion is one of the lost arts in today's world is anyone can build a fire. The lost art is controlling the fire, getting it to burn the way you want it, getting the heat to go in the direction you want it to go. As I said, anybody can build a fire, and the heat and the flames go up. In a peach like this, the skill is in heating the floor. If you simply build a fire inside a peach, and what you end up with is really hot on top and cool on the bottom. So when you put your bread in, you bring your bread out, and it's burnt on top and raw on the bottom. Controlling the fire means continually breaking it down, spreading out the hot coals, and really trying to focus the heat to go down, which is against science, right? Because heat rises. After about an hour and a half of firing the coal, most of the coals can be pulled out of the oven. This one I would think would do 12 to 15 loaves at a time. And close the wooden door, seal the wooden door with clay, come back in a half an hour, and everything's baked.
And when would these primarily be used? In the summertime? Winter?
All year round.
Mm-hmm.
All year round they could be used. The clay isn't cold weather and hot fire don't exactly complement each other, and the ovens can have a tendency to crack because of the cold. They can have a tendency to crack because of the temperature difference, if the temperature difference is happening too quickly. But they can be used all year round. In not so much here, but in reality, they were disposable items. So you bake with them, you use them, after maybe not in a family situation, but when you're really baking a lot, it cracks, it blows up, you build another one. These ones look well used, which is the way they would have looked in reality. The wooden framework I talked about is buried inside the clay. If you could cut it open, you would find charcoal ribs of the original clay are still in there. We took apart a few ovens at abandoned farmsteads to understand the construction. And as I said, a French-Canadian oven is slightly different, different cultures' version of this. And we will see a more massive oven in another homestead that we'll visit a little later on.